Really important topic as we are in an election year, you may have noticed, and the importance of making sure we have political continuity with space policy. Very important. We want to make sure that we keep up the momentum as we're returning to the moon and on to Mars. And so moderating this session is Mike French, who has a long career, and I just lost his bio here, one second. Long career in the space industry, including being the chief of staff at NASA. He was also, when he was at the American Institute of Aerospace, he was vice president of commercial space, and he now has a dual role as senior advisor at the Boston Consulting Group and space policy consulting at the Space Policy Group. So, Mike?
And thanks to Explore Mars. So I'm very excited about this panel. Let me introduce my guests and I'll explain why this is such an important panel. So on the far side here we have Brent Blevins. Brent is the majority staff director of the House Science Subcommittee on Science and on Space and Aeronautics. And Pam Whitney to my left here is the minority staff director of the same subcommittee. And so for those who don't follow maybe Congress as closely, the Senate and House have two committees who are responsible for NASA, for authorizing the NASA activities, and both of those have a majority and minority staff. So we really have two of the sort of four most important space experts here from Congress when we talk about NASA. Not just that, I'd put Brent and Pam sort of in an elite group, given their experience there. Some of the longest experience working with NASA and space issues on the Hill today. So pretty excited to have them here and to get their perspective. And so why don't we just jump right into it. I also want to remind you, though, you're the third panelist for this. So think of your questions. Probably we're going to go through some questions I want to ask the panel, but then want you to jump in here. A little surprise, I do have a crew flight test patch for the upcoming mission here, and I think we're going to vote on the best question, and I think we're going to have to give that patch. So a little controversy here maybe at the end. Actually, well, let's jump right into it. Why don't we start about where are we today? The NASA budget, we're currently in fiscal year 24, and in fiscal year 24, NASA received the first drop in its budget for the first time in 10 years, right? A fairly big deal for the space community. Why don't I just start with you, Brent, just what does this mean? Is this a reflection on NASA? Is there something else? Tell us what's going on here.
I don't think it's a reflection on NASA at all. I think it's just a reflection of math, to be frank. Last May, I'm sure a lot of you were following, there was a lot of drama over the debt ceiling and kind of how we were going to resolve that. And so then Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Biden reached this agreement that set caps on discretionary spending for the next 2 fiscal years. And I think when we see NASA's budget, it's just a reflection of that. It was we put, caps that were well below what the president had proposed in his budget for this fiscal year, or for fiscal year 24. So I don't think it's a reflection at all on NASA. I think if we look at a lot of other agencies, I don't think NASA is the only agency that had a cut for the first time in a very long time. I think there are several agencies, science agencies, National Science Foundation, NOAA, others that had similar cuts. In some way, NASA's cut was smaller percentage-wise than these other agencies. So I would just say, Mike, that I don't think it's a reflection on NASA at all. It's just sort of the reality of the numbers we were having to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Pam, what about you from your perspective?
I think Brent said mostly everything that I would have shared about this situation. Not seeing a waning support for NASA. It's continued to be a very strong bipartisan support for NASA, and but as Brent mentioned, the reality of the situation is that there are caps under the debt ceiling agreement, and so that is constraining some of the NASA budgetary environment. And in some cases, NASA did a little better than some of the other research and development agencies. So if you look at it in that context, that's a bit more positive.
And so the president asked for an increase in that money for next year to get it back to the levels it actually was 2 years ago. So kind of getting back to where NASA was. What's the outlook of 25? Do we face a similar environment?
Yes. I think the environment's very similar. The way the bill was structured for the caps for the next 2 years, there's only roughly a 1% increase for both defense and non-defense spending. So that doesn't mean that every agency gets a 1% increase. Some could go up, some could go down, but there's not likely to be a huge increase for this year. And I do want to take just a second, Mike. We had a hearing with the administrator last week, and I do think that there was, on a few occasions, we had members sort of ask questions like, "Well, why is this being proposed for cancellation? Why is the launch slipping, farther into the future?" And he rightly pointed out that it's due to the budget that Congress gave NASA. But I heard a couple times, and I feel like there's this perhaps hope or expectation that once these 2 fiscal years are up, that things are going to kind of get back to the spigot will open, so to speak, and we'll start to see bigger increases. I don't know if that's the case or not, to be frank. I think there are a lot of sort of macro issues that Congress is going to have to deal with. There were tax cuts passed in 2017 that are up next year. Not to get too wonky into how NASA's funded, but it's one of 12 appropriations bills with Department of Commerce, Department of Justice. Next year, we're halfway through the decade. The Constitution mandates the census. So then NASA's kind of competing within that smaller pot of money with the Census Bureau. And so I say all this, Mike, just to say that I don't think next year will be different, but I don't know that this year and next year are necessarily the outliers either.
Mm-hmm. Pam, what's your perspective?
Well, so, if we talk about the numbers, so 24 was 2% less than 23. 25 request is about a 3% increase over the fiscal year 24, but when you factor in inflation, which I think in January was cited at about 3%, you're basically flat with, so we aren't seeing in the near term, we aren't seeing growth. But that said, I think the desire, as Brent indicated, is there to support the mission. It's a question of how to balance within the agency's large portfolio what it's going to do. And those are hard questions. How to keep a NASA whole in its multi-mission, as a multi-mission agency, which explores human exploration. It's got space technology that's very important. It's got science. It's got aeronautics, STEM, education. So how to look holistically at the agency, and that's those are difficult decisions. But the desire and the support, from my perspective, is there. But the reality is, right, in the current physical environment, that there are going to have to be some difficult decisions.
Yep. Well, let's talk about how the parts can impact the whole, right? In particular, let's talk about a program that's really important to this audience, which is Mars Sample Return Mission. So the Mars Sample Return Mission, some larger than expected budgets and timelines. NASA made the call that it would be replanning that mission. How is that? What is the congressional impact there? What are we seeing out of Congress there, and how is that impacting NASA writ large? I don't know, Pam, I want to start to you. I know you raised it, you raised how the parts can affect
Well,
the
I think, Mars Sample Return, as many of you may know, was the highest priority of the National Academy's Planetary Science Decadal Survey. That's a broad strategic study that looks over a decade and prioritizes what the most important activities are from the science community perspective for NASA to pursue. So it has a strong consensus backing. There's been a lot of study and initial work done on Mars sample return, and recently there's been some questions about the cost and the mission concept. And so I think NASA's doing a really thorough job to try to understand what the mission's going to be, what are the cost drivers, and how to implement it effectively. I think there's a strong desire, from my perspective, to have this mission go forward. It's a once in a generation kind of opportunity. Perseverance has been up there collecting, the samples, and they're going to be waiting to be, retrieved. I think right now there's a lot of questions. It's it's going to cost. It's going to be an investment, which most large missions are, a significant investment. And I think, there's a pause on the mission. We're sensitive. I think our members are sensitive to some workforce issues, wanting to retain the talent that comes with landing and operating on Mars, which the United States has had over many missions. Want to be sensitive to ensuring that workforce is in place. There have been some workforce reductions. So there are a lot of factors here to consider. It's a huge opportunity, and I think folks are wanting to have a good plan to really get started on this mission.
But when I ask you from your perspective, is the Mars sample return have sort of the politics, is the congressional side settled on it? Is there still a lot of active sort of camps, if you would, on how folks are thinking about that on the Hill?
It's a great question, and Mars sample return, in my view, represents, when you think of the best of NASA, it represents, bold, daring, visionary, missions, doing things that aren't possible anywhere else, any other country in the world, that all that. But, currently, it also represents sort of the worst you might think of NASA at times, projects missions that go over budget or delayed, eat into other priorities and that sort of thing. I feel pretty confident when I say that, on the whole, when I look at the House of Representatives, I think there are certainly probably some people on, probably the outer reaches of each party who would probably oppose. But I think, generally speaking, the vast majority of people support this. But but again, that support is probably qualified with sort of the question of cost and timeline. I think, and I know you and Pam both lived, sort of James Webb, right? And I think if it weren't coming almost directly afterward, there may not be quite the sensitivity as there is now. And so I'm really curious to see how that's going to shake out. I mean, we're very, like everyone, we're kind of interested in seeing what the commercial sector comes back with in terms of proposals. I think there could be some neat ideas, but I say all this to say I think there's a general pretty strong base of support, but once you have to figure out architecture, timeline, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point. Go ahead.
I wanted to just add that I think one of the issues that has to be navigated with Mars sample return is because it will be a big, significant flagship, the large flagship style missions, is how to balance the entire science portfolio, as I think Brent indicated, so that you don't have one large activity eating up every other potential activity. And I think that's something that has to be navigated. But that's kind of one of the one of the realities of doing these large missions is kind of how to maintain that balance.
You know, Brent mentioned something, Pam, that I want to make sure we don't leave too soon from, which is, are there lessons from the past here? You know, he mentioned WWST. Have we had sort of other examples like this that provide any guidance on how either NASA should move forward or how the Congress should move forward?
Well, one lesson I think in NASA has been already implementing these IRBs, these review boards that take a sort of a deep dive look at a mission. That happened with the JWST when it ran into some difficulties. NASA is trying to do that process a little earlier. So that's one lesson. NASA's also, conducted a large mission study to look at kind of what it has learned from doing some of these large missions. But yeah, James Webb, was being carried out at the time we had sequestration, which was a different type of a budget, budget ceiling, very constrained physical environment. And certainly from my perspective, one of the interesting things about James Webb is that it came up with a very clear budget profile and exactly how much funding was needed to continue the mission year after year until it was completed. And Congress pretty much followed that specific budget profile. And that was just one observation I can make.
Yeah, and just to, so for folks know where we are now, giving that really good example, is NASA there yet on Mars Sample Return as to the Congress, or is that to come?
NASA has not gotten to the point of having a mission that's, the plan where they've got a defined cost at this point.
Correct.
So a key thing from your all's perspective in how we move forward.
It helps to justify to our members if we're going to make large expenditures, particularly over a sustained period of time. If there's a very tangible, concrete proposal we can point to and say, here is James Webb. It costs $9.8 billion or whatever the number was, and if we could do the same thing with Mars Sample Return, I think that helps. Yep. I think that helps. Kind of shore up member support.
So we've talked a bit about some things NASA can do here in the near term, to shore up support. Let's talk about Congress. So we have some headwinds on the budget side, but still we're still working with about $25 billion, right? Not a pretty impressive amount of money. What are the things you all are doing and thinking about to maintain support of a human to Mars program from a congressional perspective?
Right now we're writing a NASA authorization bill. There was a smaller NASA authorization that was in the CHIPS and Science Act, which was signed into law in the summer of 22. The last sort of broader, comprehensive NASA authorization was signed into law in March of 2017. A lot's happened since then. So, we're sort of contemplating a lot of the issues that we're discussing are up here, Mike, and that all of you care about too. We will absolutely be thinking about this. And I don't want to steal any of Pam's thunder, but the 22 authorization, established the Moon to Mars Program Office, which was very important to kind of help NASA structurally, and we kind of want to build on that work. Our committee, we don't appropriate dollars to the agency, but we do set policy direction, and I think that's I think that's very important because I think it gives the agency a lot more authority to act on Artemis, going back to the moon, building from there, and going to Mars. So, Pam, I'll let you add on that.
Well, I want to just dovetail off of something Brent said, which was building on authorizations. And I've been with the committee a while, and there have been several authorizations that clearly indicate Congress's interest in exploration of Mars. including, the science, but also the human exploration of Mars. And as Brent said, they've all of this NASA authorization acts have built on each other. I mean, in 2005, we had a NASA authorization that set a stepping stone approach to the future of exploration of Mars and including Mars and other destinations. In 2008, the Congress authorized activities related to Mars exploration and the development of testing of technologies and mission architectures. And in 2017, the NASA Authorization Act directed NASA on enabling humans to land on and return from Mars and other destinations on a timetable that is technically and fiscally possible. And then, as Brent mentioned, in 2022, Congress authorized the establishment of a Moon to Mars program and directed the establishment of a program office. So you have this building approach that clearly indicates a congressional interest and intent on a humans to Mars. And of course, the moon is clearly a factor in terms of a pathway to Mars. And so, for risk reduction, for science, and for enabling some of those capabilities that eventually will lead to Mars and other destinations. So
that history is really interesting, Pam, because I think obviously we talked quite a bit about the moon and the Artemis program. Would you say sort of that end goal of humans to Mars remains pretty widely shared across Congress?
I would say it's in law. That would be my answer.
No, I think that's right. I don't think, I think it's been pretty stated in multiple NASA authorizations that the intent is, take lessons learned from the moon, risk reduction, to go into Mars. I think that there's a pretty broad consensus on that, Mike.
Are there any particular, aspects of a new authorization that is sort of particularly important to, I'll start with you, Brent, maybe on the majority side?
Well, continued support for human exploration efforts. I think that's, that's the top priority for virtually all of our members, through Artemis, through different components of Artemis. So I think that's very important. I think something that we're still trying to think through a little bit, coming back to Mars sample return and how science missions at NASA are managed. I think it's something we're putting a lot of thought into. We have great respect for the decadal process and how that's implemented. And don't get me wrong, I'm very much aware that a lot of NASA missions are on time and within budget, but I think we do want to be mindful of what can Congress do that can help ensure that some of these larger flagship missions, aren't eating into other areas, and we're maintaining this balanced science portfolio with different types of missions and across different divisions at NASA. So I would say those are, and one last I'll mention too is kind of what, and maybe not as relevant to this group, but kind of what is our future role in low Earth orbit. Obviously, we're looking at a transition in a few years, post, ISS, and kind of contemplating that and how we should be thinking about that, what guidance and direction we should be giving NASA. So I would say those are three priorities that I'm thinking about.
Pam, just want to see if anything from your perspective.
I guess just thinking about the title of this summit, I guess one question might be, and this is just, I'm speaking from my own perspective here, not representing anything official, but just the role of science in the human exploration program. I think NASA is carrying out some strategies for its lunar exploration activities and its science-based strategies for its lunar exploration. And I think just we're seeing that question arise in more dialogue now in terms of the role of science in the human exploration program. So I guess that would be another question that potentially could be something that comes up in an authorization.
So let's talk about what NASA can do to help maintain bipartisan support from your perspective. So we already talked about from Mars sample return, there's some numbers that are needed, some out-year planning. What are some other things that the Congress either is looking for that NASA maybe could take some affirmative steps that would maybe help increase support?
Do you want to go?
I can start, in terms of other issues for an authorization or
Really just, to the extent that NASA can play a part to the extent we want to build and maintain bipartisan support, are there things NASA could do that would strengthen it? Is there something, either decisions they haven't made that they could make or information they could get you, things like that may help the congressional support build?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, and this is, I don't think in any way sort of endemic to NASA. I mean, I think there's always a little bit of tension between executive branch agencies and Congress, sure. But I mean, I think we're always looking for transparency and getting information sooner rather than later. I think, Chairman Lucas last week at our committee hearing, the first thing he asked about, there was a, story in Ars Technica about potential architecture changes, a mission profile for Artemis 3. And, the administrator said it was speculative. And, perhaps it is. I think, I use that as an example, and we're going to be digging into that a little bit more in the coming weeks. But, I think it's always a lot easier if, you present Congress challenges and, either financially or from a program management standpoint, rather than kind of waiting at the end and say, here's the dead cat, do with it what you will. So, again, I know it's a very general answer, but, getting information sooner rather than later and not finding it out through various media sources.
I would echo that. I mean, I think members like to see a strong plan, rationale, and then to understand the cost basis for some of these major initiatives, and just having as much information, as Brent said, as possible, and having that robust rationale. And sometimes that might even include, well, why did you propose this and not this? And so that they can, have confidence in that initiative. And again, at the end of the day, it needs that support in terms of appropriations. So the more robust that kind of information can be, tends to help.
Mm-hmm. We've obviously got very strong congressional supporters on the House Science Committee as well as on the Senate Commerce Committee. We have lost quite a few of very large presences and congressional support across the House and Senate over the last decade or so. Any thoughts on how we can build more champions or steps maybe the stakeholders here or NASA itself could do to help increase the congressional champions for what we're talking about?
My thought is that it's important to reach out to non-traditional members, not just those with a NASA center in their district or a large contractor or that sort of thing. Actually, just next week, I think NASA's doing something very smart. They're hosting a reception in the Rayburn building on the House side. We're talking about their partnership and their work with USDA. And I thought, okay, that's really good because you're showing the impact of what you're doing is important to the work of farmers and ranchers across America. People who don't live within hundreds of miles of a NASA center or a big research university or a contractor or whatever the case is. And I thought that was really good. So I think not just for this audience, but space advocates in general, it's really important to find those sort of like little touch points that maybe aren't apparent, but you dig in and it's like, eureka, that's why I should be supporting, an increase for NASA.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of our members like to be able to discuss with their constituents how the investments in NASA benefits folks, right at home. Whether it's, health benefits. I mean, if you look at JWST, it helped improve ocular measurements of the eye because of the work that they did on optics for JWST. The International Space Station has helped understand bone loss and bone density issues because of the low gravitational environment and the need to mitigate that. That can have benefits here. But our members are always looking for ways to be able to share how, yes, we want to do these ambitious and inspiring missions that push the frontiers of discovery and exploration, but in doing that, there are tangible benefits to society and to folks in their everyday lives.
Well, I know we have a very informed and energetic audience here, and so this is your chance to ask two of the key congressional leaders here on space issues. Why don't we come on up to the mic?
So, looking at the ACR document that came out earlier this year, one of the key tenets for why we go is national posture and for inspiration. How can we leverage that from a policy-making perspective to look at what we're doing with the Moon to Mars objectives and leverage that towards continuing our goals? Thanks.
Well, I guess NASA just did a fairly huge national outreach effort for the solar eclipse. And I think when it comes to some of these milestones, if you're talking about, if the question was about humans to Mars or exploration, I think, really trying to find different ways to reach folks, different institutions. You've got the Space Grant, which is a national nationwide set of universities and groups of universities, is trying to sort of find means to spread the message and collectively bring that excitement to some of these big milestones. That's one thought.
Go ahead.
For me, this was more of a personal question. With the recent budget cuts, I was wondering why budget cuts weren't made in places other than NASA, because NASA takes up less than 0.5% of the national budget. For example, the military this year got $800 billion, which makes up 13% of the budget. Along with that, even compared in the military budget, the U.S. Space Force only got $29 billion this year. And just considering the fact, with the huge difference, even a mere eighth of the military budget, which only takes up 13% of the overall budget, would be enough to quintuple the NASA budget.
That is a great question. And I think I think you could tell you have a sympathetic audience here. So again, not to get too wonky, but how the budget process starts is the president submits a budget proposal to Congress. That usually happens in February or March or sometime, and we like to joke, the president proposes, Congress disposes, but at the same time, though, that proposal is sort of the foundation for how, we divvy up money. And obviously, we kind of deviate from that in some instances or another. I would say personally, I'm with you. I am fully, fully supportive of your position. I have yet to figure out how to make that reality, and I think there are a lot of other smart people who've had that same challenge. So,
I don't know, Pam, if you want to jump in on that one. No. Well, something just something to think about in that question, which is kind of to the structural point that Brent talked about, is the way the budget and the appropriation gets through Congress. Really, at the end of the day, a lot of the tensions of how much NASA gets actually really resides on also how much those other agencies that Brent was talking about. At the end of the day, it really comes down to how much goes to the Department of Justice, how much goes to the Department of Commerce, including our friends at NOAA who run our weather satellites. And so the way the budget functions, there really comes down to these much smaller cuts before you get to these, kind of bigger. You can't quite take it from something that's outside of that bill once those overall frameworks are set. And so that's actually something NASA suffers from in a bit, because it is a slightly different than some of the other agencies it lives with. And so many people have actually talked about funding NASA more akin to how the Department of Defense is funded, because it does programs like the Department of Defense. So a lot to talk about. We have a separate panel on this topic next year. Go ahead.
Well, first, let me thank you for coming today, and this is a wonderful panel. I want to kind of pick up on the last young man's question and ask something else a lot of us in this room have been watching. Right now we have Chang'e 6 on its way to the lunar far side. We've watched China over the last few years do more and more ambitious missions. They have Chang'e 7, Chang'e 8 planned for the next several years, building to potential human landing on the moon by 2030. So in these budget-constrained times, I'd like to get a sense of Congress. Does it matter if China beats us to the moon?
Yes, it does matter. So the House Science Committee, I think, every hearing that we've had has to some extent been about ensuring U.S. competitiveness across the research and technology and science development enterprise. And so we're very mindful of what China's doing. And I think just a very random side, I was actually at a wedding with Rahm Emanuel, the ambassador to Japan, former mayor of Chicago, chief of staff of the White House, so on and so forth. And he asked me about this. I was like, oh my goodness. This man who has all this responsibility is aware of that. That's a pretty strong motivator for, I think for House members. I think it's a very compelling argument. We've tried to leverage that in different ways. When it comes to lunar planetary science, we've probably focused a little bit more on human exploration, as you're aware, but I think it's very compelling.
I think members are increasingly aware of other nations that may have different values and what they're doing, and it kind of is focusing, in my view, in my perspective, it's focusing their attention on some of these big questions about the U.S. and its international partners, and the importance of that, and the importance of making sure we continue to move forward.
And I think, Brent, the hearing you mentioned just last week, where I think Administrator Nelson was certainly keen on that, and really had quite a bit of back and forth with almost the entire committee on that topic. Yes, sir.
Well, thanks. I certainly hope you're right about that, and thank you very much, and thanks for coming down here. So a lot of times, talking to representatives, very few, almost none of them will say they are not in favor of space and NASA. I mean, they'll all give at least lip service. Oh, yes, we love space. The congressman loves NASA. But then when it comes down to actually dividing those budgets, very small sliver goes to NASA. So how can we, and one of the things I've heard is they say NASA does not do a very good job of selling itself. And they're prohibited from lobbying, but they do try to make some of their, they do make an attempt. Is there anything, now you made the suggestion of moving the NASA budget potentially into a different bucket or its own bucket. So are there things like changes in that allocation as you proposed, or another position, or somebody within NASA whose job is to tell Congress what's going on in their district, where these grants are going, when, who's being assigned to this? Because they're not, the message is out there, but they're not all getting it. They don't understand, and we just don't, and Congress is not alone, but we don't put enough emphasis on space in this country. So what can we do as organizations and as advocates to, perhaps either change some, make some intrinsic changes that would ensure a long-term, positive change to the budget, or just ongoing support? Any ideas about that?
I would say, I would say NASA actually does a lot better job of selling itself than a lot of its sister and cousin agencies. And I don't say this disrespectfully, but you don't go overseas or, across the country and see people wearing NSF shirts or NOAA shirts. Or, and I don't say that pejoratively to them at all, but, I think Pam made this point. I think NASA has done a lot better job in recent years of picking up on those sort of, national, global events and, figuring out how that nexus, how they can connect to that. I don't, and I will also say, NASA actually does a pretty good job. I think, Mike, you may have worked on this when you were at NASA, the little charts that have, here's what's in every congressional district, here's what's in every state. So, again, I don't know that it's necessarily a question, and Pam may disagree, if NASA's not doing a good job of selling itself. I think it's just sort of the larger structural budgetary issues.
I don't really have anything to add. I think, the inspiration factor is what NASA has to, and they leverage it very well in terms of really the outreach to schools. Sometimes it's astronauts or scientists that may come to schools. Those things can't be discounted because they are huge tools that allow, students and families and communities to connect to that NASA mission and to sort of really get that excitement and vibe, which can carry over into looking more at what NASA is doing, looking at some of the big questions and programs that NASA is carrying out. So I think that awareness and leveraging that inspirational tool is vital.
Well, we're near the end of our 7 minutes of terror here, but I see we'll let Dr. Green bring us home.
So I worked at NASA for many years, as you know, and one of the biggest things that could be helpful, no matter what, as the budget even we talked about, it's not so much raising the budget, but ensuring that the budget is steady in the sense that we have multi-year appropriation, because we get caught up in these continuing resolutions and it's paralyzing. If we can stop that and provide a continuity in the budget, we can stay on schedule and keep the costs down. So where are we on that?
Well, actually, let me ask you a question. When was the last time NASA had its full year appropriations before October 1st?
I think it happened once or twice in my 42-year career at NASA.
It was 1996.
Okay.
And I think that was the same for NIST, NOAA, and
Yes,
all the
that's
other
right.
agencies.
So this is why the multi-year appropriation, so we can just keep running and going on and making sure that we stay on schedule, which is critical. Again, let me give you an example. The amount of money that we have and the schedule that we have are intimately related, okay? If you stretch out the schedule, you're going to add more money. So if you make the schedule just perfect, you then can really make the mission happen economically. And we do impossible stuff, okay? So it's not like going in and having your kitchen replaced, all right? So you know how many kitchens are replaced every year in this country? Gazillion. And I bet hardly any of them are on time and on budget, whereas that's expected of NASA. The way to help us is to keep us on that schedule with money coming in, and therefore we'll be able to make it. That's just my thought.
Well, I want to thank Pam and Brent here for just the great discussion, taking quite a bit of different questions here, and just bearing with a whole range of things on Congress's behalf, although not for attribution to that extent.
Just one thing, and I don't want to speak for Pam, but my name's Brent Blevins up there. My email, my work email is brent.blevins@mail.house.gov. I'm on LinkedIn. I work for you all. I'd love to hear from you, so please, got an open door. Happy to talk anytime.
I'll share that too.
Well, thank you both.